Good afternoon. 7th of June, 2025, the autonomouscollective.net. Welcome to Weekly Marx. What we're going to look at today is the French Reconstruction of Capital, 1872 to 75 essay in the back of Karl Marx Capital Volume 1, the 2024 translation by the two Pauls. William Clare Roberts has written extensively on Marx, some really interesting works. And this one in particular is useful because the fact is the project, the 2024 project, is a integration and summarizes in reasonable detail one of the issues of the differences among translations. What is the family resemblance, as it were, among these three translations, English, French, and German, noting, of course, that German was Marx's native language, and the fact, he lived in France and et cetera, et cetera. It's a worthy little essay. And so this is part of Weekly Marx. I think we're almost done. I think we're finally done with looking at this latest translation, and I'm glad we got to the end. On the other hand, we'll see what happens next on the Saturday version for the next couple of weeks of Weekly Marx. But this is a good essay. It's worth considering because of the time and effort that Marx took in to do the translation. And I mean, obviously, there was a reason to do it, to provide it in some folks' native language and to further the publication. He never got to a Russian version, which would have been kind of even more interesting, with all due respect. So, needless to say, a complete project. The French Reconstruction of Capital, 1872 to 75, by William Clare Roberts, 2024. Please tell me, dear teacher, in a few words, if the principles that I lay out before you accord with your doctrine, and if the conclusion of the principles developed in your book will accord with a communist maxim. I hope the book will not earn you further persecution. The method is completely different from that applied by the French and other socialists. I do not take as my starting point general ideas such as equality, but I begin, on the contrary, with the objective analysis of economic relations as they are, and that is why the revolutionary spirit of the book reveals itself only gradually. Can the French even do dialectics? Engels was skeptical. The straitjacket of modern French compels a writer, he claimed, to bow to the dictates of a pedantic formal logic. The distinguishing feature here, of course, the difference between modern and classical French. English, too, requires making sacrifices in the translation of genuinely dialectical passages, but at least English has an energy and brevity that allows one to compensate for this somewhat. The combination in French of formalism and prolixity makes the language singularly ill-suited for theoretical writing. Now, this may seem a strange claim, but Engels is not alone in affirming something like it, nor is it merely an expression of German linguistic chauvinism. Daniel Ben Said, surveying the wreckage of French Marxism, argued that the development of Marxist theory in France had been hobbled by the absence of dialectical thought. I think it's a detour, but anyway. Alain Badiou has lamented the mechanistic and scientific approach that has gripped Marxism since its introduction into France by Lafargue and Guisset. Declaring that France has only ever produced four eminent dialectical thinkers, Pascal, Rousseau, Mallarmé, and Lacan. Positivism mechanistic thinking, formal logic, empty phraseology. These are the congenital faults of French theory. Now, these doubts regarding the French capacity for dialectical theory also cast a shadow over the French translation of Capital. In the letter quoted above, Engels was not complaining about French in general, but about the chapter on factory legislation in the French translation. In this case, Marx responded to Engels' criticisms defensively, telling his partner that if he can persevere with it, he will find that some passages are superior to the German. Nonetheless, it's easy to criticize the French edition in Marx's name. In a famous letter to Nikolai Danielson, Marx claimed that in Le Capital, he was sometimes obliged, principally in the first chapter, to aplatir the matter in its French version. To those who worry about the relative lack of theoretical or dialectical precision en français, this this letter indicates that Marx had to aplatir or flatten the complex German presentation, or else that the French translation simplifies much of what is more fully explained in the current English and the fourth German editions. And I think that we've seen that some recent works looking at the Miga, really are about trying to figure out um, some of these niggling activities, as I think you can see in the Saito thing on Marx's eco-socialism. Anyway, a full accounting and assessment of the changes Marx introduced into the French edition is beyond the scope of a short essay. The major changes, however, can be easily surveyed. Marx eliminated the subtitle A Critique of Political Economy. He split chapter 4 into 3 chapters and chapter 24 into 7 chapters, which he divided off as a separate part 8, L'accumulation primitive. He significantly rewrote chapters 14 through 16 and 15 to 17, eliminating the discussion of formal and real subsumption, and 4 paragraphs that review the argument while adding in 10 paragraphs discussing John Stuart Mill. He also substantially rewrote chapters 20 to 22, expanding his analysis of wage and productivity differentials and adding 5 paragraphs of new material, comparing English conditions to continental and Eastern European conditions. Throughout parts 4 through 6, Marx elevated numerous footnotes to the main text and introduced new empirical cases and illustrations. He also generally eliminated references to Book 4, which was to treat the history of the theory of value, aka the theories of surplus value. There are also many subtler changes which seem highly significant to some readers. Marx introduces the distinction between the concentration and the centralization of capital, and he seems to emphasize the role of credit in capital accumulation. He seems to downplay the positive effects of machinery, cast doubts on the unilinearity of economic development, and sideline property relations in his discussion of small-scale production. In almost every chapter, Marx either cuts or adds individual sentences, and the translation even more often reformulates, eliminates, or adds clauses. There is ample material, therefore, for debate and disagreement. Now, looking at the whole range of these changes, there is certainly evidence for the belief that the French edition simplifies or popularizes aspects of Marx's argument. Now, given how much time and energy he put into revising Joseph Roy's translation and his evident concern over its quality, he worked on the translation off and on for over 3.5 years. Marx was a surprisingly unfussy translator. He seems to be quite comfortable with a degree of semantic shift that can make those of us invested in the conceptual specificity of Marx's language squirm. From Marx's other extant letters concerning the French edition, it seems that his major specific complaint about Roy's translation was its excessive literalness. Writing to Maurice Lachatre, the publisher, Marx claimed that Roy translates too literally in the easy passages, but he shows his strength in the difficult things. Nevertheless, your corrections would always be useful materials for me in the final correction. For the final correction, I have here the assistance of Longuet, Vaillant, Lissac, Lisagare and other competent communards, Lachat seemed to concur, reiterating to Marx at one point the recommendation that I've already addressed you to entrust one of your sons-in-laws or your French and writerly friends to read the proofs in order to remove certain Germanisms that the translator has left in the text. In another letter to Danielson, Marx explains this by reference to his sense of the requirements of his French readers. Although the French edition, Marx writes, has been prepared by a great expert in both languages, he's often translated too literally. I have therefore found myself compelled to rewrite whole passages in French to make them palatable to the French public. Given the way that Marx approached his revisions of the text, therefore, it can reasonably seem that the French translation blunts the conceptual precision of the German original. A couple of examples will illustrate the issue. Marx's vocabulary for discussing power and force undergoes an important shift between the German editions and the French. In German, Marx uses four terms especially to name the worlds of power, to discuss the power to do things and the power of some over others, the impulse given to the means of production and the impulsion of the worker to work, the coercive power of the state's laws, and the compulsive power of the need to sustain oneself. These terms are Macht, Kraft, Gewalt, and Zwang. In the German text, these terms are not generally interchangeable, but are associated with particular and generally overlapping conceptual domains. Macht refers to production and to the state, Kraft to labor and production, Gewalt to the state and the class struggle, and Zwang to the law and the market. Gewalt and Zwang come to the fore in part 3 as soon as exploitation comes into focus as an object of analysis. Kraft and Macht are more prominent whenever the material production process is being analyzed. In the French edition, these regularities disappear, although French has a similar set of words to German. Pouvoir, puissance, force, and coercion. Le Capital uses force so widely that it displaces the specificity of all the other words. The other terms are still used, but force translates every single one of Marx's German terms on a regular basis. Therefore, the associations of individual terms with specific domains do not carry over into the French. Now, this affects the shape of what we might call Marx's ontology of labor and capital. In Das Kapital, there is a regular, if not exclusive, association of Macht and Kraft with nature, including with the natural productive capacities of human beings, and of Gewalt and Zwang with anti-nature, whether the monstrosity of capital or the externally coercive impositions of the law and the market. These associations disappear when Arbeitskraft and Produktivkraft are replaced by force de travail and force productive, even while force also translates Gewalt in almost every instance. Another instance of this apparent loss of specificity in the French edition has been discussed by Kyle Bosch. Interrogating Althusser's reading of Capital, Bosch notes that the 1872-75 version of Le Capital is highly inconsistent in its translation of the more idiosyncratic terms that decorate the opening chapters. Bosch especially highlights the word Trager, which is central to Althusser's conception of structural causality. Trager is generally rendered as port, but is often omitted or rendered as support or soutien instead. This is significant, Bosch argues, because while the German text associates Trager with the world of the theater, with character masks or personae that individuals or individual use values wear in certain circumstances, the French text undermines this association by the addition of a structural metaphor in which individuals support economic interests and roles the way beams and columns support a building. The structural rendering of support erases the possibility that individuals are separable from that which they support, an implication central to the theatrical frame of reference. Instances like these seem to substantiate the concern that the French edition is a less precise, or conceptually rigorous version of capital. However, the coin has another side. There are instances, even in chapter 2, or even in chapter 1, the very chapter where Marx was especially compelled to aplatir the matter, in which the French translation introduces precision in the place of vague or ambiguous German. For a minor instance, a footnote early in the book declares that, quote, a governing notion in bourgeois societies is the fictio juris, that every person who buys commodities also has an encyclopedic knowledge of them, unquote. Marx expanded on this rather obscure claim in the French, adding, quote, no one is supposed to be ignorant of the law, unquote. In other words, ignorance of the law is no excuse. This clarifies that the fictio juris in question is akin to the rule, buyer beware. Later in chapter 1, the second edition claims that different instances of labor can become fully equal only when their real non-equality is abstracted away, only when they are reduced to the common character they have as an expenditure of human labor power. That is, abstract human labor, unquote. In the French edition, Marx adds a crucial specification of the mechanism of this reduction to abstract labor, writing, quote, it is exchange alone that works this reduction by bringing the products of the most diverse labors face to face on an equal footing, unquote. In these cases and others like them, the French edition has a concrete specificity that the more abstract or indeterminate German text lacks. The most theoretically significant of these instances appears in the most famous passages in Capital. In his discussion of the fetish character of commodities in the second edition, Marx claims about the people frequenting the market that ihre eine gesellschaftliche Bewegung besitzt, für sie ist sie die Form einer Bekunft von Sachen, unter deren Kontrolle sie stehen, statt sie zu kontrollieren. Unquote. This sentence is reproduced unaltered in the third and fourth German editions. Commentators relying on the German editions have generally understood the antecedent of the final phrases unter deren Kontrolle sie stehen, statt sie zu kontrollieren to be Sachen, S-A-C-H-E-N. That is, they have generally understood Marx to be saying that the exchangers of commodities, rather than being in control of their products, are controlled by things. This reading has also dominated the English language literature, since all of the English translations have rendered Marx's claim that way. This reading has encouraged an assimilation of Marx's argument in this section of chapter 1 to two arguments he makes elsewhere. First, Marx makes a series of claims, both in Volume 1 and his drafts and notebooks, about the tendency of capital to appear as a set of physical objects, that is, machines, tools, buildings, etc., rather than as a set of social relations among wage workers and capitalist employers. Now, in this context, Marx repeatedly claims that capital, which is produced by the labor of the wage worker, dominates the workers who create it. It is, quote, dead labor which dominates and sucks the life out of labor power, unquote. This claim clearly has the same form as the common reading of the claim from chapter 1. Instead of being the mere means of labor manipulated by the worker and subordinated to the process of labor, capital appears as a master that manipulates the worker and subordinates the labor process to itself. In machinery, Marx claims, this apparent reversal takes on a, quote, palpable technological reality, unquote, embedded in the apparatus of production. Second, and more generally, both the claim in chapter 1 about exchangers in the market and the claim in chapter 13 to 15 about workers in the factory are frequently integrated with Marx's writing on the Einfremdung of the worker from 1844. In his Paris notebooks, Marx wrote that the alienation of the worker from the products of their labor results in the fact that the worker becomes a servant of their object. This seems to be Marx offering a philosophically general account of the specific phenomena analyzed in Capital. As Marx writes, quote, All of these consequences subsist in the determination that the worker relates to the product of his labor as an alien object, or the object of another. For it clearly follows from this presupposition that the more the worker elaborates himself, the more powerful the alien objective world he creates over against himself becomes, and the poorer he himself and his inner world becomes, the less belongs to him as his own. Unquote. The consequence, therefore, of bringing the passages from Capital together with Marx's 1844 notebooks is that the fetishism of the commodity is understood along the same lines as the fetishism of capital, and that both are rooted in the development of alienation. On this basis, fetishism is taken to refer generally to any case of, quote, human creations which have somehow escaped, inappropriately separated out from human control, achieve the appearance of independence, and come to enslave and oppress their creators. Unquote. This interpretation of fetishism has come to be central to the English and German scholarship on Marx. According to Moshe Postone, one of the most influential Marx scholars of the post-Cold War era, Marx's vision of a post-capitalist society centers on the, quote, historically generated possibility that people might begin to control what they create rather than being controlled by it, unquote. This contention rests on the presupposition explicit in Lukács that labor creates both material products and the social relations that arise out of the circulation of those products. As Postone claims a few pages later, quote, the modern capitalist world, according to Marx, is constituted by labor, and this process of social constitution is such that people are controlled by what they make, unquote. This all emerges from a plausible reading of Marx's claim in the German texts of Capital. The English translations, which uniformly render Marx as saying that in market exchange, commodity producers are controlled by things, are reasonable. Marx's German sentence might actually mean just that. Interestingly, however, the French edition does not say that producers are controlled by things. In French, the passage reads, the value character of the products of labor only emerges, in fact, where, where they are determined as quantities of value. These latter change ceaselessly, independently of the will and foresight of the producers, in whose eyes their own social movement takes the form of a movement of things, a movement that, far from them being able to direct them, herds them about. This claims that producers are led or herded about by the movement of things, and in particular by the constant changes in the quantity of value. The measure of the quantity of value is the labor time socially necessary to produce it. But this, quote, changes with every variation in the productivity of labor, unquote. These constant changes appear to the producers, moreover, only in the form of changes of prices in the market itself. Now, putting these things together, the text of Le Capital says that the producers of commodities are driven about in their social interactions by the changing prices of commodities, rather than having the power to themselves direct those price changes. In other words, the French edition argues that the commodity producers are price takers, not price makers, and that changes in relative price levels drive the buying, selling, and producing activity of commodity producers. The specification, however, is a stumbling block for the interpretations that have based themselves in the predominant reading of the German text. On the basis of the French text, there is no obvious homology between what Marx says about market-dependent producers in Chapter 1 and what he says in Chapter 13 and 15 about workers' confrontation with the objective manifestation of capital. That market-dependent producers are price-sensitive does not imply that they encounter the product of their own activity as an independent thing. Rather, the products of others represent the value of their own product, which cannot represent its own value. Nor does it imply that the social relationship between themselves and other market goers appears to them in the guise of thing-like factors of production. Now, the connection between the French text of chapter 1 and Marx's 1844 remarks on alienation is no more intuitive. The claim that market-dependent producers are price takers, not price makers, has no clear resemblance to or basis in the claim that producers are separated from and then dominated by the product of their labor. It does not imply that producers confront their own product as an alien power over themselves, nor does it have any clear or immediate relationship to the situation of factory workers who do encounter capital in an objective form, the form of the machine factory itself. The French text here confronts the reader with the multiple levels of dialectical mediation that separate chapter 1 from chapter 13-15. The situation of market-dependent producers who must sell in order to buy and buy in order to live should not be identified or conflated with the situation of factory workers who must work in order to live and must keep up with the machine in order to work. Neither market-dependent producers nor wage-dependent workers are in control of their respective situations, but the out-of-controlness of the two is distinct. And while the two situations are causally related, they are not instances expressing one and the same dynamic of alienation. Part 3. The conceptual distance between these three, that is, Marx's analysis of the fetishism of commodities, his analysis of labor's constitution of the power of capital, and his earlier conception of alienated labor, may be given some measure by bringing in another term to which all three might be related: ideology. Scholars have noted the absence of the word ideology from Marx's discussion of fetishism, indeed from the entirety of Capital. Etienne Balibar has called special attention to the fact that there is nothing about ideology in Capital, and that this is part of a larger absence in the work of Marx and Engels. Quote, a 20-year eclipse of the crucial term ideology following its massive use in the German ideology, unquote. Of course, the word does appear occasionally 4 times in Volume 1, plus one more occurrence in the postface to the second edition. But these few appearances are mere mentions, and they seem far afield from the work's treatment of the quote, theoretical models that figure in the classical analyses of ideology, unquote. The models, quote, pertaining to commodity and money fetishism, and more generally, to the inverted relation between the deep sphere of production and the superficial sphere of exchange. Now, taking into account the fact that, quote, after Capital, the term fetishism appears in turn from the texts of Marx and Engels, unquote, Balibar concluded that, quote, if the question of ideology is constitutive of historical materialism, then several relatively incompatible approaches are involved, unquote. And studying these incompatibilities and discontinuities should be central to the product of disclosing and exploring, quote, the internal contradictions of the Marxist problematic, unquote. Charles Mills concurred, but was more categorical, critical of the conventional view that ideology is a broadly pejorative term for Marx, whose reference includes fetishism, despite the fact that Marx does not use the word in analyzing fetishism. Mills argues that the meaning of ideology has been stretched and distorted far beyond anything Marx and Engels seem to mean by it. According to Mills, Marx and Engels consistently used ideology to indicate the superstructure of society and ideologists to refer to superstructural workers in general. From this primitive sense, they derived a pejorative use of the term to refer to idealism, which they thought to be an occupational hazard of superstructural work. Those who specialize in superstructural labor are prone to, quote, a characteristic illusion that their immaterial ideal products, that is, ideas, politics, laws, etc., are causally independent of the material economic base, and this illusion is idealism, unquote. On the basis of this textual analysis, Mills concludes that Marx and Engels had no all-encompassing concept of ideology as mystification, and that the goal of extracting from Marx and Engels' writings a general theory of ideology as anti-science and mystification has been chimerical all along. Now, in line with these analyses, we can say that rather than a chain of equivalences, fetishism is alienation, fetishism is false consciousness, fetishism is ideology. The text of Le Capital ought to impress upon us a set of discontinuities and disjunctions. Fetishism is not alienation, as we've already seen, nor is it false consciousness. The fetish character of commodities may be phantasmagoric, but in it, the social relations among the private labor of the exchangers appear as what is in fact the case here. Things mediate the relations among people, while there are social relations among things. Fetishism is the accurate perception by commodity producers and exchangers of being jerked around by commodities changing prices. Nor is fetishism ideology. Marx and Engels' original scientific program was to explain how, quote, the social organization and the state continuously emerge from the life process of definite individuals, but these individuals not as they appear in their own or others' imaginations, but as they really are. That is, as they work, produce materially, and thus as they work under definite material limitations, presuppositions, and conditions independent of their will. Unquote. In keeping with this original aim, Marx in Chapter 1 of Capital is interested to show how certain illusions of the economists, such as the idea that nature plays a part in forming exchange value, evolve out of the material life process of commodity producers. These illusions are not fetishism, however. They are, in fact, a theoretical misprision, misprision of fetishism. Damn. And these illusions are not properly ideological either, since, as Mills rightly notes, economists like Bailey, who claim that a pearl or a diamond has value as a pearl or a diamond, are deceived by their own crude materialism, not because they, as ideologists, take thoughts and ideas as the basis of their existing world. Not every error is ideological. However, there is one place in Capital where Marx does directly connect a mystery of the market with ideology. It is in the relatively neglected part 6 on wages. As Marx writes in the French, the recompense of the laborer is represented as the wages of labor. So much money paid for so much labor. The payment of wages, therefore, seems to be a species of the exchange of commodities, and the labor market is supposed to behave like other markets, with buyers driven to the cheapest suppliers and sellers driven to compete on price and quality. This appearance of exchange is false, however, and its falseness is massively consequential. As Marx claims, quote, the wage form or the direct payment of labor makes every trace of the division of the day into necessary and surplus labor, paid and unpaid labor, disappear, so that all the labor of the free worker is supposed to be paid. This form, which expresses only the false appearance of wage labor, renders invisible the real relation between capital and labor, and shows precisely the opposite. From this derive all the legal notions of the wage workers and the capitalists, all the mystifications of capitalist production, all of the liberal illusions, and all of the apologetic evasions of the vulgar economists, unquote. Now, here we have what we do not have in the case of fetishism, that is, the direct explanation of ideology, les notions juridiques, les illusions libérales, les fausses fuyants apologetiques, by reference to the material basis of society, to its participants and observers, workers and capitalists and economists alike. The exchange of wages for labor power looks to be the exchange of wages for labor. Now, it really seems as if the wage worker is being paid to perform a given service and that the employer is paying to have that service performed. The value of the service seems to determine the wage. The workers may argue that the service they perform is more valuable and that the wage should be raised. The employers may argue that they are the best judge of the value of that service and that they can only pay what the service is worth to them. The whole argument, however, turns around the fixed point of the fair equivalence between the service and the wage. As Marx puts it in two sentences, he added to the French edition, quote, "The wage is the payment of labor at its value, or at a price that diverges from this." It implies, therefore, that the value and accidental price of labor power has already undergone a change of form, which makes them appear as the value and price of labor itself, unquote. However, and this is the fundamental point of Marx's theory of capitalist exploitation, the wage transaction does not give to the employer a definite service. Rather, it gives to them the use for a definite time of a human being. Marx underscores this in the French. All editions claim that what the money owner directly encounters on the market isn't in fact labor, but rather a worker. However, where the German continues, quote, "What the worker sells is his labor power," unquote. The French adds the important clarification, quote, "What the latter sells is himself his labor power," unquote. So there's this, it's a subtle distinction. What and how much service the employer gets out of the use of that human being is not determined by the wage transaction, but by the employer's government of the workplace. The question I ask, I suppose, let me break there for a second, is this the same as Foucault's governmentality? But anyway, this is why Marx has to lead the reader into the, quote, "secret laboratory of production," unquote, in order to uncover, quote, "the great secret of modern society," unquote. Only in chapter 17-19. Therefore, do the readers of Capital find the piece of Marx's analysis that allows them to connect Marx's theory of commodity exchange, including his famous remarks on fetishism, to his theory of exploitation, including his famous remarks on passing from the surface of society into the hidden abode of production, and to his account of capitalist production itself, including his remarks on the alienation of the worker's power. And only here does the reader find a link between exchange, exploitation, and capitalist production on the one hand, and ideology on the other. Only in chapter 17-19, in other words, do readers of Capital find the rudiments of Marx's explanation of the emergence of an ideological superstructure from an economic base. It is in the wage transaction that Marx locates the origin of the definition of freedom as self-determination, which occurs among all, especially German, ideologists. Because it is here that he locates the origin of the liberal belief that, in the words of the coiner of ideology, the word ideology, the Comte de Tracy, quote, "society is purely and solely a continual series of exchanges," unquote, which transactions have the admirable quality that the two contracting parties always both gain. There is a tendency in the literature on ideology as a concept to downplay the connection between Tracy's original formulation of ideology as a science of ideas and Marx's critical attacks on ideologists. In fact, the continuity is direct and overwhelming. Tracy's ideology is the paradigm case of Marx's ideology, a superstructural effort to reform society by reforming ideas. Tracy wanted to reform the world by means of education, and the education he meant to provide was fundamentally an education in political economy. His goal was to realize society as a totality of voluntary and mutually beneficial exchanges, and to do so by enlightening the consciousness of social agents so that they could see what they were trying to do and do it in the most rational way possible. Marx thought this was illustrative of the approach of bourgeois political economy as a whole. To a ready-made world of capital, the political economist applies notions of law and property handed down from a pre-capitalist world, notions of law and property that emerge from market exchanges between independent producers and that spontaneously assimilate the sale and purchase of labor power to the sale and purchase of finished goods. Marx thinks that the facts contradict the economist's ideology, but that these facts, that is, the overwork and exploitation of laborers, the domination exercised by capitalists, the conquest and expropriation practiced by capitalist nations, elicit from economists only, quote, more nervous zeal and unctuousness, unquote, in their preaching. This point needs to be renewed and insisted upon today. The reforms proposed by political economy and the supposed rational outlook it propounds are founded, according to Marx, on an irrational expression, the value and price of labor. This ideological founding is itself a consequence of the fact that society that political economy reflects is founded on labor as a commodity. Political economy borrowed this irrational expression from the everyday life of that society where it circulates in the marketplace of ideas, but without reflecting on it critically. Marx's critique of political economy is fundamentally a critique of this irrational expression, the value and price of labor. Strikingly, however, Marx came to refer to it as an irrational expression only in the French translation. In the German editions, he calls it instead an imaginary expression. Now, in mathematics, there's an important distinction between imaginary numbers and irrational numbers. Imaginary numbers, which all have the square root of -1 as a factor, are incomparable because, the square root of -1 is not a real number. It is impossible to say whether any given imaginary number is larger or smaller than any other number. Hence, Marx had analogized the price of honor or conscience to imaginary numbers back to chapter 3, since these qualities can be offered for sale at a price, but without having a value according to which they can be compared to real commodities. Irrational numbers, on the other hand, are numbers like pi, which cannot be expressed as ratios of two integers. Irrational numbers can be compared. Pi is greater than e, that is Euler's number, for instance, but cannot be precisely determined because they express incommensurable magnitudes. Now, by this shift of calling the value of labor imaginary to calling it irrational, therefore, Marx shifts from implying that the value of labor is as unreal as the price of honor to implying that it is real but indeterminable. There's no common denominator between labor and commodities whereby the value of the former could be defined. Incommensurability, not incomparability, is the salient feature. The thought implicit here is not fleshed out by Marx, however. Indeed, the change he introduces in the French here also introduces a potential confusion. In chapter 3, Marx had included the price of uncultivated land among the instances of the imaginary price form, since it doesn't contain any objectified human labor. In chapter 17/19, however, he compares the value of labor to the value of the earth. Now, where the German text used imaginar in both contexts, the French text calls the price of uncultivated land an imaginary expression, but the value of the earth an irrational expression. How much labor is realized in the earth? The German editions of Capital claim that the answer is 0. The French edition implies that the question makes as little sense as asking how much labor is realized in labor. The right answer to this question, or whether there is one, need not detain us. What is significant for our purposes is that the French translation both clarifies and troubles the reading of capital. Capital is not all of a piece, neither between editions nor within a single edition. It is indisputable that Marx used the opportunity presented by the translation to rework and revise parts of the text. It's also indisputable that no clear boundary can be drawn between this process of revision and the process of translating the German prose into French prose. The two bleed into one another all the time. The debate between those who see in Le Capital a refinement and perfection of Das Kapital, and those who see in it a simplification or vulgarization, is unresolvable in principle. Number 4. There is a great irony, therefore, in Marx's claim that he had to aplatir the matter in its French version, flatten it out. As I have argued, the French version is neither flat nor smooth. Marx's translation choices in crucial instances disrupt the too immediate assimilation of discontinuous and incomplete analyses. The example I have focused on here is the assimilation of fetishism to alienation and ideology, and there is further irony here. For too many readers, Marx's words, the means by which he sought to reveal the modern social world, have come to master the perception of the world itself. Marx's predilection for certain rhetorical figures and images, inversion, chiasmus, the sorcerer's apprentice, become not so much a key by which the reader opens up his analyses as an iron mask that effaces equally all of their features. Attention to the changes made in the second German and the French edition should demonstrate the bankruptcy of this approach. A great deal of information about Marx's attitude toward and practice of translation comes from the letters he wrote to his French publisher, Maurice Lachatre. Besides these clues, however, Marx's correspondence with Lachatre indicates a crucial part of the context for Marx's revisions for both the French translation and the second German edition. The translator, the publisher, Marx's French and writerly friends, the competent communards he could count on for assistance with the translation. These are so many arrows pointing to the most important factor in Marx's revisions, the Paris Commune of March to May 1871. Marx informs the readers of the second German edition that he was told only in the fall of 1871 that the first printing was sold out, and the second printing would begin as soon as January 1872. Doubtless Marx's sudden notoriety during and immediately after the Commune contributed to the demand for capital. The International Workingmen's Association, the IWMA, was at the forefront of the Parisian uprising, and Marx was widely regarded in the press as the leader of the International Workingmen's Association. The publication of his pamphlet on the Civil War in France in June 1871 brought him to the attention of a much wider audience, and his defense of the Commune drove interest in the doctrine professed in his theoretical tome. At the same time, the destruction of the Commune dramatically changed the political situation of socialists on the continent. The militants of the French working class had been killed, arrested, and transported or scattered into exile. The failure of the Commune held two significant lessons. The absence of a working class political party in France had meant that there were no representatives of the workers in Versailles who might have raised a hue and cry in the National Assembly against the terroristic policy pursued against the Commune by the Thiers government. At the same time, the inability of the Commune to appeal effectively to the provincial population of France left Paris a sitting duck, which indicated the need for a socialist policy for approaching rural producers. Both the formation of working-class political parties and the study of modes of agricultural production would, therefore, occupy much of Marx's energy in the remaining decade of his life. Despite Marx's stated belief in 1870 that only England can act as a lever in any seriously economic revolution, the Commune showed that the political rule of the producer might also serve as a lever for uprooting the economical foundation upon which rests the existence of classes, and therefore of class rule. Marx's remaining energy was devoted to exploring this possibility. Now, while all of these developments were already apparent by the time Marx was rushing through his revisions to the second German edition in 1872. They had ripened by 1873 and 1874, when Marx was at work revising Roy's translation. Marx received the last installment of Roy's draft on October 27, 1873. He did not send the final sheets of the revised translation to Le Chart until mid-1875, shortly after the Gotha Congress cemented the Eisenachers and the Lassallians into the Sozialistische Arbeiterpartei Deutschland. A year after this, Marx was engaged in heavily revising another translation, that is, the German edition of Lisagre's Histoire de la Commune de 1871. This occupied Marx for almost a year, from October 1876 to August 1877, and was a central means of making the case for Marx's political line in Germany. Up to and including the foundation of the Parti Ouvrier in 1880, Marx spent a decade engaged with the Commune and its aftermath, and with the effort to build a new, post-Commune political foundation for working-class self-emancipation. The French edition of Capital, which took up 3.5 years in the middle of this decade, must be read as part of this effort to adjust and refine theory to changing economic and political realities. Marx's effort of translation was imposed upon him by the world he sought to change. Capitalist society is a moving target, yes, but also an internally variegated one. The French context was not the English context, nor was it the German context. French was substantially underdeveloped. France was substantially underdeveloped from the standpoint of capitalist industry. It began to undertake a process of state-led industrial development in the 1850s and 60s, with Napoleon III's championing of the Credit Mobilier and the massive expansion of the railways. Despite accelerated urbanization under the Second Empire, however, the rural agriculturalists remained by far the largest sector of the people, and population growth was painfully slow. Now, if Marx could confidently declare to the German reader that, quote, the country that is more developed with respect to industry merely shows that the less developed one what its own future will look like, unquote. This was not so clear in the case of France. Hence, Marx hedged a bit, declaring only that the more industrially developed country only shows to the one that follows it on the industrial ladder the image of its own future. France was Russia before Russia was a country that might not follow Britain on its climb up the industrial ladder, but might instead find a different route to communism. The result of comparing the German and French edition of Capital, therefore, is not that somewhere between vulgarization and refinement, we find the truest, final, or most precise version of Marx's concepts and arguments. Rather, what is most significant is the work of rewriting Capital for a changed and changing political and economic context. There is no original context to which Marx's work in Capital can be confined, nor any final context toward which it develops. Marx's project in Capital always departs from where it begins, in the hope of reaching somewhere else. This is true in the crudest material form. Marx wrote in London, but in German and French. He was enthusiastic about the Russian edition. When he hoped for an English translation, he was thinking of an American translation. The International, of which Capital was the manifesto, was always, of necessity, a work of translation and retranslation. In the translation of Marx's compressed German into smooth French, and in Marx's laborious unfussiness about the work of translation, therefore, perhaps we can discover his concern to disclose the facts about the dynamics of a society dominated by the capitalist mode of production. William Clare Roberts, The French Reconstruction of Capital, 1872 to 75, and I won't torture you with my pronunciation of the French and German. Suffice it to say, the notes are pretty extensive for this essay, and it's quite reasonable to look at because he did go down and look at the details of the correspondence, so that is quite good, um, and particularly the extensions to other writers, which is I think is important. Um, this one is peculiarly interesting, or at least to me, is Note 31. One of the reasons that Lukács is felt to have anticipated the discovery of Marx's 1844 manuscripts is that he articulated this understanding of fetishism already in 1920, 12 years before the David Ryzanov led team at the Marx Engels Institute published their edition of Marx's notebooks. In his essay on class consciousness, Lukács already brings together the sentence from the fetishism section of chapter 1 with the claim from later in Capital that capital is a social relation, not a thing. The pursuit of a sociologically lawful history merely expresses, Lukács writes, the fact that people in bourgeois society are at the mercy of the forces of production. This is immediately followed by his citation of the line from chapter 1, which is supposed to serve as a proof text. He then generalizes, claiming that Marx's view is confirmed by the ostensibly natural and rational laws of classical economics, and that the entire perspective of political economy is upended by Marx's insistence that capital and every other gegenstaatlich form of political economy is not a thing, but a social relation among persons mediated by things. Georgy Lukács's Class Consciousness in History and Class Consciousness in Marxist Dialectics, 1971, the MIT version, translation modified, et cetera, et cetera. And let's see, that one was a really interesting set of ideas to move into the Lukács stuff. And then the Mills reference is Charles Mills' Ideology in Marx and Engels Revisited and Revised in From Class to Race, Essays in White Marxism and Black Radicalism, 2003. Let's see. I think this, well, without getting too far into, yes, here we go. This one was also interesting. This is 57, note 57. Celui-ci, ce que celui-ci vend, c'est lui-même sa force de travail. Misunderstanding this point or not seeing it at all underlies the errors of otherwise disparate interpretive and critical traditions. Lukács did not grasp it. Therefore, he concluded that the worker has an epistemically privileged position within capitalist society since, quote, the worker recognizes themselves and their own relation to capital in the commodity. Marx's argument in chapter 17/19 is precisely that the wage form militates against this recognition, since the wage seems to be for labor, that is, the worker's service, rather than for labor power, the worker themselves. Thus, Lukács is led to claim that, quote, that while the reification process and becoming a commodity of the worker stunts and cripples their soul, nonetheless, the worker's human spiritual being is not transformed into a commodity. Marx disagrees. The sale of labor power is the sale of the, quote, ensemble of physical and intellectual abilities that exist in the human body. In the living personality, that is, l'ensemble des facultés physiques et intellectuelles qui existent dans le corps d'un homme, dans sa personnalité vivante. At the opposite end of the Marxological spectrum, John Romer has made the same error. Romer argues, quote, struggle between worker and boss on the factory floor over the extraction of labor from labor power is a mere, quote, dispute over the terms of the labor contract, unquote, and is therefore beside the point of Marx's account of exploitation, which assumed frictionless markets with costlessly enforced contracts. This takes for granted the notion that the wage contract specifies fully, or at least could so specify, the service is to be delivered. This is what Marx denies. And, you can get into a big argument about this, about de jure versus de facto and blah, blah, blah. An important thing, which is worth um, further discussion. And this particular collection, the one edited after Marx, edited by Terry Ball and James Farr, is a good thing to look at because it does come at a point where all of those things begin to integrate in useful ways, that is relative to the analytic Marxist project, etc. Uh, and let's see. Robert says, therefore, I disagree with David Harvey's claim that the later chapters on wages are pathetically thin. Um, and another on David Harvey. This is 68. David Harvey confuses matters by assimilating the rate of interest to Marx's analogy. Drawing on volume 3, Harvey claims that the rate of interest is an irrational expression, which Marx elsewhere likens to irrational numbers in mathematics. He claims that the comparison to irrational numbers takes place in the passage in chapter 3. However, that passage does not include a reference to interest, and as we have seen, does not refer to irrational numbers, but to imaginary numbers. And I'm sure there's an article floating out there that plumbs the depths of the difference between irrational and imaginary numbers. So that's for other things to look at. Let's see. Uh, they're okay. So I got to the end. Thanks, everyone. uh, Ideological poisoning. Yes, indeed. Let me thank you. This is the Autonomous Collective .net. We've been looking at Marx, the afterword essay by William Clare Roberts in Karl Marx Capital, Volume 1, the 2024 edition, translation in English by the two Pauls, North and Ritter. And let me thank you for your attention.